She walked slowly, but not because she was in a hurry. When you learn to survive in silence, every step carries a story no one wants to hear. From a distance, she looked like just another woman on the sidewalk, the kind the city trains itself to ignore. But something about her presence unsettled people. Maybe it was the steady gaze, maybe the bag worn beyond repair, or maybe the fact that she didn't lower her eyes for anyone. She didn't beg, didn't shout, didn't pose a threat, yet she was stopped. It all started with a public bench and a command no one dared to question. Within minutes, the police radio crackled, and what seemed like a routine stop would become one of the city's greatest shames. Have you ever seen someone arrested for carrying an old bag? Have you ever witnessed an entire system scramble to erase a single image before it could speak? What if I told you that behind a quiet face was a scar the government tried to bury? Someone erased from history, because remembering her meant confronting what the country chose to forget. No, this isn't a story about revenge. It's about what happens when the world calls crazy someone who just wants to be heard, and how an object nearly worthless can ignite a fire of memory that no one can put out. Because some things don't scream, they burn. They say some wars don't end on the battlefield. Some continue quietly inside us, in empty halls, in unjust protocols, in eyes that don't lie. Some soldiers return with medals, others with wounds. But the most dangerous are the ones who return with truth, the ones who don't need to raise their voices to shake foundations, the ones time could not break, who carry the strength of a whole army in their silence. She was like that, invisible to most, impossible to ignore if you looked closely. And in a cold precinct where paperwork outweighs dignity, someone dared to ask, "Do you even know who she is?" But by then it was too late, because once her name surfaced, there was no going back. The damage was done, and she wasn't the one who owed explanations. The system did. The country did. The city that claimed to honor heroes, but never looked at those who bled quietly. From that moment on, every word she didn't say became a headline. And still, she remained silent. Because sometimes those who've been forced to scream inside their whole lives have already learned, silence makes more noise than any speech. And now, what happens when the secrets of a buried past threaten to rise? When the woman everyone ignored becomes the only one who can unravel a lie holding up institutional pride. This story isn't just about a bag. It's about everything they tried to hide inside it. A name, a code, a promise. It's about quiet courage, about memory with no spotlight, about a reunion between justice and dignity, and about what happens when an entire nation must kneel before the truth it tried to silence. So before you judge the one who walks slowly and carries little, maybe ask what she's really carrying. Because some stories aren't written in books. They're sewn into the fabric of the forgotten. And when those stories come to light, no rank, no command, no excuse can stand against the shame. Get ready, because today you'll meet a woman who, without raising her voice, made the whole world listen.
But before listening to this exciting story, if you are not yet subscribed to our channel, subscribe now and become part of our community.
The sound of boots on the damp pavement was barely audible, as if the city chose to ignore her presence. Opal Jenkins walked with restrained but steady steps, clutching the old canvas bag like it was part of her body. It was late afternoon. The sky pale and a cutting wind carried scents of grease, gasoline, and forgetfulness. Cars sped past, indifferent to the woman with old glasses and a faded military coat. A group of teens laughed on the corner but fell silent as she passed. Not out of respect, but confusion. She didn't care. She was used to being invisible. Her eyes scanned the buildings like someone carrying scars the world can't see. And deep inside the bag, hidden beneath a hand-stitched lining, the small oxidized metal plate trembled softly. With each step, she passed the old mural on the library wall, sepia images of the city's soldiers, all white men smiling with gleaming medals. No women, no faces like hers. She paused for a moment as if trying to recall something time had tried to erase. An old man walking with his grandson glanced at her and mumbled something about strange folks around here. She heard it, but kept walking. The sky began to darken, and her military coat no longer held the chill. Still, there was dignity in every move. In her hand, a worn keychain with the image of a broken eagle, a gift from a platoon brother who never came back. It was all she had left of war and memory. She wasn't headed straight to the Elias Woodrow Veterans Center that day. Instead, she stopped at the concrete bench near the school, sat slowly, adjusting the bag on her lap like guarding a story too precious to lose. Children began spilling out the school gates, and she watched in silence. She wasn't waiting for anyone. Just liked seeing the young ones run. It reminded her that the future still existed even in a country that forgets. A woman recognized her from afar, smiled shyly, but didn't approach. Time had taught Opal that kindness was rare when you carry the weight of the past. Still, she offered a calm look in return. Beneath the bench, an old newspaper flapped in the wind, headline reading, "Precinct 47 launches new street safety policy." She leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. The ache in her knee, an old companion, throbbed like an unending memory. Thoughts flooded in, jungles, sirens, coded voices, broken promises. She whispered softly, "I'm still here, Lord. Keep me steady." Words she said every night before sleep. The bag on her lap seemed to pulse, as if guarding a secret that still demanded to be heard. Instinctively, she ran her fingers along the reinforced seam inside the canvas. There it was, the plate. Cold, heavy, etched with numbers and letters erased from public records. The Delta Division no longer existed on paper. But she remembered, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Opal didn't move. She was used to suspicious glances. Since coming home, the world didn't know where to place her. Not quite a soldier, not quite a civilian. A shadow with too much past and not enough voice. The patrol car drove off, but the unease remained. She caught her reflection in the window of a closed shop. Gray hair, steady eyes, silent lips. And there, in the stillness, a courage that didn't need a uniform. The world may not remember, but she'd never forget who she was, or what she did to keep others alive. They'll never understand what this bag carries, she thought. And she stayed still like scenery no one sees, until it's too late. Inside Precinct 47, Captain Karen Whitmore sipped coffee with an irritated frown. A subordinate entered with a report. "There's a woman sitting by the school with a large bag. No ID." Karen sighed, annoyed. "Another one? Log it. Routine patrol." The alert echoed through the radio. On the security feed, a camera showed Opal sitting on the bench, motionless like a statue. Karen barely glanced. "City's full of them. We need to clean this up." Officer Jamal Reese, newly assigned to the district, watched quietly, unsettled. Something about the woman seemed different, but he said nothing. At the Veterans Center, one of the residents flipped through an old photo album. Seeing an image from a forgotten mission, he murmured, "Looks like her, but no one talks about that." The name Opal Jenkins was scribbled faintly on one of the pages, nearly illegible. On the wall, an open Bible displayed the verse, "Those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength." The city had no idea who they were about to arrest. But time has a strange way of correcting injustice, and on that gray afternoon, fate was already moving, whether anyone noticed or not. Back at the bench, Opal looked up at the sound of footsteps. 2 uniformed officers approached, hands already on their belts. She didn't move. She knew what was coming, but she was too old to run and too grounded to hide. The faith she carried was bigger than the fear. And before they even spoke, she whispered to herself, "They won't take my story. Not again." Her eyes locked onto theirs, and for a brief second the young officers hesitated. It was the silence that did it, a silence full of past, of promises, of scars that were never seen. The command room of District 47 felt like a gray vault where emotions weren't welcome. Old computers hummed softly, drowning out the silent tension in the air. Captain Karen Whitmore paced through the space like she was walking a courtroom. Her gaze allowed no questions, only results. She scanned reports with practiced coldness, missing nothing. On the main monitor, an image caught her eye. A black woman sitting alone near a school. Karen frowned. Homeless, near a school. That attracts trouble. Proceed with approach. No one questioned her. In this room, orders were law. The patrol was deployed. Jamal Reese sat at a desk in the back trying to keep a low profile. He was new, barely a month into the precinct. But that image on the screen unsettled him. The woman didn't look lost. She didn't look dangerous. There was something in the way she held her bag, the way she sat still. He got up and took a closer look. "Do we know her name?" he asked. A colleague shrugged. "No ID. Probably lying like the rest." Jamal went quiet. He returned to his desk, but he kept the screen open. That look stayed with him. He'd seen it before, in his grandfather's eyes when he spoke of war. Karen returned to her office and activated the internal radio. Her voice was sharp and dry. "Unit 12, proceed. If there's resistance, cuff her." There was no room for doubt. No room for story. In Karen's mind, order came before understanding. Every situation was a potential scandal. Everything needed to be silenced. "No surprises," she repeated often. To her, women like that one didn't bring honor, they brought risk. As she sipped her lukewarm coffee, the camera zoomed in on the woman's bag. Karen shook her head. Always hiding something. But she had no idea what was coming next. Outside, the seasoned officers neared the school. The street was quiet except for the soft hum of the cruiser. One of them eyed the woman on the bench. "She doesn't look like a beggar, but big bags are always trouble." The other laughed. "Let's see what Granny's hiding." Hands rested near belts. Protocol was clear. They approached in formation, like facing a threat. Opal didn't move. Her gaze followed them calmly, as if she already knew. That calm unsettled them. But still, they proceeded. Meanwhile, Jamal couldn't take his eyes off the screen. His hands trembled, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was the way she held her gaze. Maybe it was how the city treated its ghosts, pretending they weren't there. He remembered his grandfather, a forgotten hero with no medals, carrying a worn bag full of war papers. He'd say, "We come home, but the home never comes back to us." It was the same look in that woman's eyes. That couldn't be coincidence. And something in Jamal began to awaken. Karen returned to the monitor and stared coldly. "Any suspicious movement?" she asked. One officer responded, "Negative, but she refuses to hand over the bag." Karen sighed. "Take it. Don't make a scene." Silence followed. To Karen, this was just another box to check. What she didn't see was that the woman on screen wasn't just resisting. She was surviving. Her silence wasn't defiance. It was armor. But to Karen, silence meant challenge, and challenges needed suppression. In the precinct hallway, an older detective shuffled through dusty files. He saw Jamal passing by and whispered, "You know, most of the veterans we arrest shouldn't be here." Jamal paused. "What do you mean?" The man showed an old file with names scratched out. "They have pasts no one wants to deal with, so they pretend they don't exist." Jamal nodded but said nothing. He returned to his post. The woman on screen was about to be confronted, and no one knew who she really was. But Jamal was beginning to sense this went deeper than it looked. As the officers approached, a gust of wind lifted Opal's scarf, revealing a small cross on a thin chain. The camera caught it. Jamal saw it. Karen didn't. The radio buzzed. Initiating approach. The screen flickered. Then for 2 seconds it went dark, right as one officer reached for the bag. Jamal stood up. Something inside told him this wasn't normal, but no one listened. And when the system came back, the story had already begun to slip out of their hands. The wind blew sharp as the two officers stepped off the curb toward the bench. Their boots struck the damp pavement with heavy intent, each step carrying silent authority. One officer kept his hand close to his holster. The other fixed his eyes on the seated woman. Opal Jenkins didn't flinch. She sat motionless as if the moment had been foretold. Her worn canvas bag lay across her lap, gripped naturally but firmly. The sky had darkened above, casting shadows across the school wall. No one spoke at first, just a standoff of gazes. "Good afternoon, ma'am. ID, please," said the taller officer. She didn't answer. She just raised her eyes. The second officer stepped closer. "Routine patrol. We need to check your bag. Ma'am." His voice was clean but carried veiled contempt. Opal tightened her hold on the strap. "That's not yours." Her voice was soft but steady like aged steel. They exchanged glances, surprised by her calm defiance. "Refusing a lawful order is obstruction," one warned. She stayed still, gaze unwavering. "Taking what isn't yours is theft." The silence between them turned electric. A car slowed nearby. A man inside watched briefly, then looked away. No one ever steps in. No one ever does. The first officer lunged for the bag. Opal shifted slightly, shielding it. The motion sparked irritation. "We'll use force if necessary." School children exiting nearby paused to stare. A mother hurried her daughter away. Opal didn't move. She closed her eyes for a moment. A whisper escaped her lips. "Lord, hold me." When her eyes opened, they carried the weight of decades. Still, she remained still. Still, she didn't yield, and that made her dangerous. "You're under arrest, obstruction, and impersonating a military officer," the officer declared. The accusation was swift and cold. Opal didn't resist. She rose slowly, dignity pressed against her back like armor. When one officer grabbed the bag, she pulled back. "Drop it, old lady." "No." Her voice didn't rise. It sank like stone. Bystanders had gathered. Phones were recording. But all they saw was a frail woman resisting, and officers doing their job. The real story was invisible. The handcuffs clicked onto her wrists without care. The sound rang louder than the wind. One officer held the bag like a trophy. "This goes straight to evidence." Jamal Reese watched from the precinct camera. His stomach turned. That silence, he knew it. It wasn't guilt. It was memory. Pain, compacted and buried. He rose from his chair, uneasy. "Who is she?" he whispered. No one answered. The patrol car pulled away. The radio repeated, "Female, no ID, bag confiscated." Inside the car, Opal stared out the window. The streets blurred past, empty and familiar. Her breathing was steady, her eyes distant. She knew this road led to more than a cell. It led to another kind of trial. Her bag, separated from her, was now in hands that would never understand its weight. A past forcibly buried, a truth long denied. She leaned back and whispered, "They'll see." No one heard her, but the words were spoken, and inside them, a promise lived. At the precinct's front desk, an officer tossed the bag on the counter. "Detainees' belongings," the clerk scribbled without looking up. Jamal approached, carefully. He waited until they stepped away. He opened the bag with slow precision, dug past worn fabric and ordinary items, then felt something cold and solid. He pulled it free, a weathered metal plate. The edges were rough, the letters faint. Delta 19. Beneath it, "Oh, Jenkins." His heart raced. What he held wasn't just an object. It was the beginning of something far bigger. The cell was small, cold, and lit by a flickering yellow bulb on the ceiling. The air reeked of rusted metal and cheap disinfectant. Opal Jenkins sat on the concrete bench, hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the opposite wall. She didn't speak. Didn't protest, didn't cry, didn't ask for anything. Her silence seemed to breathe like an invisible veil holding back the world's violence. Outside, the precinct buzzed with the usual noise. Rushed footsteps, sharp voices, phones ringing. But inside that room, time felt suspended. The cross around her neck touched her chest gently. And there, between iron bars and erasure, she prayed. Without words, without movement, just presence. In the command room, Karen Whitmore stared at the monitor coldly. No valid ID, no military records, no government profile. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and sipped her coffee. Log it as confused civilian. Create a new file. Her tone left no room for argument. To her, the case was already done. An elderly black woman, defiant and undocumented. That was all it took to be dismissed. Delete the arrest footage before this turns into something it shouldn't. An officer nearby hesitated. "Are you sure, Captain?" She replied with a look, the kind that said, "I give the orders, and no one here's going down for some nameless old woman." Meanwhile, Jamal Reese sat in the records room holding the metal plate. His fingers trembled. The object was old, heavy, scarred by battle. The engraved name, O. Jenkins, rang in his head like an echo of a truth America had buried. He entered the serial number into the internal system, cross-referencing it with restricted military files. The first search came up empty, the second, blocked. On the third attempt, something appeared. Operation Delta 19 classified only 3 survivors. The blood drained from Jamal's face. Slowly, he looked up at the screen, and there, among faded black and white photos, was her, young, in uniform, metal on her chest, the same eyes. The weight of that discovery hit him like hail. He stood, walked to the door, and closed it gently. Took a deep breath, leaning against the wall. "Dear God, what are we doing?" He whispered to himself. He thought of his grandfather, of stories told through tears, always spoken with reverence. There was a woman, saved 12 of us, wounded, alone, no backup. Then she vanished. Nobody ever found her. Jamal swallowed, hard. She was real. And now she was just a few feet away, being treated like institutional waste. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was armor. Back in the cell, Opal remained seated. Her knees ached. Her old military coat was stained with dust and sweat. But she did not bow. When the door opened, it was Jamal who stepped inside. He didn't speak, just stood there watching. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. There was no fear, no anger, only resolve. For a few seconds, neither moved. The silence between them spoke louder than any report. He held the plate in his hands. "Is it you?" he asked, voice barely audible. She looked away. Her eyes returned to the wall. "I don't need to prove who I am." The words sliced the air. Jamal felt them land deep. "They're trying to erase you," he said quietly. "They've tried before," she replied. The ease with which she spoke of being erased shook him, as if she'd lived it too many times to be surprised, as if each line on her face carried a memory this country refused to honor. Jamal sat across from her, unsure what to do. "Why didn't you say anything?" She glanced at the cross on her chest and whispered, "Words don't protect me anymore, but silence, and sometimes does." He understood. For the first time, he truly understood. This woman had survived by staying whole, quietly. At the front desk, Karen was signing off. On the closure forms. Transfer her to city processing. Nothing else to do here. Her voice sounded content. One more issue solved. One more threat controlled. But just before the file finalized, a notification popped up. Confidential access by user JR. Karen narrowed her eyes. Reese! She shot up from her chair and rushed to the records room. The terminal was empty, but the last screen was still open. Opal's young face stared out from the military file. Karen slammed the monitor shut. Her eyes narrowed further. She knew something had just slipped beyond her control. In the cell, Jamal stood slowly. I'm going to figure it out, and I'll do it the right way. Opal looked at him again. Don't do it for me. Do it for the ones they forgot. Her voice lingered in the air. He nodded silently. As he stepped out, he locked the door gently. The hallway was empty. The precinct suddenly felt larger, colder. Karen waited at the end of the corridor. Their eyes met. She forced a smile. Everything good down there? Jamal answered. For now. But something inside him was already set. Opal's silence had found an echo, and someone had finally begun to listen. The silence of the precinct at dawn was broken only by the hum of overhead lights and the soft tapping of keys. Jamal sat alone in the confidential archive room, lit only by the glow of the monitor. His eyes scanned the screen like a man gasping for air. Delta 19, undeclared combat zone, 3 survivors. The images showed young, dust-covered faces, hollow-eyed. And there, in the center, Opal Jenkins. No caption, no official record. But it was her. Same jawline, same determined gaze. This wasn't speculation. It was truth, buried alive. And now, it screamed inside him with the weight of decades. Among the scanned documents was a typewritten letter that caught his eye. Unit under heavy fire. Jenkins assumed command after Lieutenant fell. Orchestrated retreat. Saved 12 lives. Jamal held his breath. The words seemed to sweat on the screen. It was an old document, yellowed with age, something that should have been lost. But it wasn't. Someone had tried to erase it. At the bottom, a faint red stamp. Confidential, restricted use, Delta file. Jamal leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just a police error, it was a national debt, and they were about to bury her. Again. In the command room, Karen Whitmore reviewed the overnight reports. Nothing unsettled her like variables off script. She noticed Jamal hadn't clocked out. Is he still here? She asked the night guard. The man nodded. Said he had unfinished paperwork. Karen pressed her lips. She could feel something slipping. She went to the master terminal and typed an override code. The screen showed unusual access to military archives. One name pulsed in the corner. O. Jenkins. Karen paled. That damn kid. She stood up. For the first time in years, she felt fear. Jamal saved the files onto a flash drive tucked under his shirt. He knew this could cost him his job, or worse. But some things shouldn't be buried without consequences. When he heard footsteps down the hall, he tucked the drive out of sight. The door creaked open. Karen, their eyes locked. It's late, Officer Reese, she said with forced calm. Investigative research, ma'am. Nothing outside protocol. He smiled slightly, not breaking eye contact. Karen stepped inside, scanning the room. Did you find what you were looking for? Her voice carried poison. Jamal answered steady. More than I expected. Karen moved closer. Let it go. It won't lead anywhere good. Her voice was softer now. Almost personal. The world doesn't care about old war ghosts. She had her chance to be remembered. She chose silence. Jamal folded his arms. Or was forced into it. Karen stiffened. You know what happens To people like you who challenge the system? He nodded. Yes, I do. The tension between them thickened, two worlds colliding. But only one carried the truth. And the truth didn't shout. It endured. Jamal left the room without another word. In his inner pocket, he carried the story of a woman who saved lives while bleeding. In his chest, the weight of a decision he couldn't undo. As he passed the holding cell, he paused. Opal was awake, eyes fixed on the cross at her chest. He didn't go in, just whispered, "I saw." She didn't reply, but her breath changed, and in that second he knew she trusted him. Outside, the city slept. But justice had begun to stir, and her name, though unspoken, was no longer buried. The next morning, investigative reporter Sonia Blackwell received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside were digitized photos, stamped documents, and a handwritten note. Look into Opal Jenkins. Start with Delta 19. Sonia was seasoned. She could smell a buried truth just by touching the page. Something about that name felt familiar. She dug into her old notebooks, found a quote from 1993. "A black woman saved us. I never saw her again. I think they erased her." Sonia's eyes widened. "My God," she whispered. And in that moment, Opal's story began to rise from the dark. Midnight settled over the precinct with a strange kind of silence, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The phones rang less. Footsteps in the halls sounded more cautious. In the basement, the light in Opal Jenkins's cell remained on, casting quiet shadows across pale walls. She was still awake, eyes fixed on a spot on the ceiling, the cross on her chest unmoving. She hadn't spoken a single word since her arrest, and yet no one could ignore her presence. Her silence seemed louder than any report. Officers avoided her cell when they could. Those who passed didn't hold her gaze. She said nothing, but everyone felt that something inside her was still alive and waiting. Jamal Reese walked with purpose toward the holding cell. He'd slept just 2 hours in 2 days, his face lined with exhaustion. But something burned inside him. Urgency, rage, maybe shame. In a leather folder, he carried printed copies of everything he'd uncovered. Operation Delta 19, Opal's photo, the buried testimonies. Sonia Blackwell had received the digital versions, and the story was in motion. But Jamal knew truth alone wasn't enough. It needed a voice. It needed her voice. He had to ask, did she still want to speak? Did she still believe her story deserved sound? He stepped inside the cell without a word, bringing only a chair and respect. He placed the chair in front of her and sat, laying the metal delta plate across his knees. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wall. "You've been forgotten long enough," he said, "but the whole country might finally listen." Still nothing. "The press will publish tomorrow. Your face, your name, your mission, it's all in there." His voice cracked, but he held steady. "But the one thing no one can do for you is speak your truth." There was a pause, longer than the others. Then she turned her head slowly. Her eyes locked on his, and for the first time, she chose to speak. "My voice hasn't been whole since that day," she began. It came rough, like it had clawed its way out. "After the mission, they rewrote the reports, told me to lie, told me to disappear." Her hands shook slightly as they touched the cross. "They stripped my name, my rank, left me with pain. Just pain and faith." Jamal didn't speak. He listened. And in that silence, she kept going. "It's not that I chose silence, it's that no one ever wanted to hear." Her voice was low, but every syllable carried years. Decades of memory, weight, and fire. "I tried telling the press. They twisted it, made it a sideshow." Her voice was steadier now. "People only listen when it entertains them. But the truth? They bury that." Her eyes filled, but no tears fell. I kept quiet because it was safer, because the world didn't want a black woman hero, they wanted a ghost. Jamal looked down at the plate in his lap. "And now?" he asked. "Do you still want to stay hidden?" She rose slowly and placed her hands on the cell bars. "Let them print it, but I'll speak too. They'll hear what they did, from me." Outside, Karen Whitmore watched the alerts with a clenched jaw. She'd just seen the headline draft, Opal Jenkins, the erased general. The story wasn't live yet, but it was ready to launch. She called her superiors in panic. "We need to stop this, now." But the voices on the other end were frantic. "It's out of our hands. Don't talk to the media. Don't touch the detainee." Karen felt the floor drop beneath her. For the first time in years, she was no longer in control. The woman she tried to silence now had an army behind her, not of weapons, but of memory and truth. And Karen had never known how to fight that. In the cell, Jamal set his phone on the floor and tapped record. Opal inhaled, sat upright, and adjusted the cross around her neck. "You recording?" she asked. He nodded. Then she began. Her voice trembled, but didn't break. "My name is Opal Jenkins. I served this country, and this country erased me." The words rang through the cell like ancient bells. "I don't want medals. I don't want pity. I just don't want anyone else to disappear to serve." The recording lasted minutes, long, aching minutes. And outside the cell, Jamal felt something rare, the truth, gaining a voice. Outside, night fell across the city. Street lamps flickered on. Sirens wailed in the distance. And inside homes, TVs lit up with the first breaking news alerts. Investigative report, forgotten war heroes, and the fight for recognition. In her newsroom, Sonia Blackwell typed the final sentence of the article. Below the title, she placed the quote Opal ended with, "They silenced me with shadows. Now they'll hear my voice, whole." Sonia blinked back tears, smiled, and hit publish. At 6:42 a.m., the headline exploded onto screens like a quiet bomb. Opal Jenkins, the General America Forgot. Her face young in uniform, eyes sharp and steady in black and white, filled the morning news. Within 10 minutes, the article was everywhere. Veterans groups, civil rights forums, social media threads. The story was clear, undeniable, and loud. The Delta 19 plate, the hidden reports, the forgotten mission, and at the center, the audio recorded inside the cell. Her voice, low but unbreakable, said, "I served this country, and it erased me." The country was finally listening to what it buried. And this time the explosion came not from weapons but from words. Inside the precinct, chaos arrived in waves. Phones rang nonstop. Reporters banged at the doors. Officers texted silently, their eyes heavy with fear. Karen Whitmore, pale, locked herself in her office. She stared at her laptop screen as headlines multiplied like fire. Each update another cut to her name. Veteran abused by police. Heroine detained without ID. Captain ignored evidence of service. She stood up and threw her mug against the wall. The crash barely rose above the radio. Detainee in cell 2 confirmed as decorated war veteran. Karen felt it. Her wall was crumbling, and this time, no command would stop it. Jamal stayed quiet as the chaos unfolded. He sat near the cell, hands clasped, eyes steady down the corridor. He wasn't looking for credit. He just waited. When the first reporter got inside the lobby, she walked straight to him. "Did you know?" she asked. No mic, no camera. He replied simply, "I listened before anyone else did." And that was all. Inside the cell, Opal heard the noise from afar but didn't smile. She sat still, head low. Justice, when it comes late, never tastes sweet. Her cross remained steady on her chest, and her silence now was an act of self-respect. The Military Justice Directorate issued a formal statement confirming the documents' authenticity. Historical omissions will be reviewed. The Veterans Association president voiced public support for restoring Opal Jenkins's name and rank. News stations aired her photo again and again, campaign footage, training shots, her name scribbled in old reports. Now all of it came rushing back. A country built on forgetting was being forced to remember. A CNN anchor, visibly moved, said live, "Today we begin correcting a 40-year injustice. And that starts with a name, Opal. What had been seen could not be unseen. And what had been said could not be unheard." Karen was summoned to an emergency hearing. Suit pressed, voice tight, she tried to explain the procedures. "You didn't check the bag? Didn't recognize the name? Didn't search the database?" they asked. She answered with clipped, defensive phrases. But no one listened anymore. Her name was trending, and not as a leader, but as a symbol of institutional silence. Outside the building, cameras waited. She tried to pass quickly, but one voice pierced through. "Do you have anything to say to Opal Jenkins?" Karen stopped, looked around, but no answer came. Her voice, once so dominant, now failed her. Back at the precinct, officers began gathering in front of Opal's cell, some out of duty, others from guilt, most from respect. No one said much, neither did she. But one officer stepped closer. He removed his cap, voice low. "Ma'am, I'm sorry." She lifted her eyes slowly, didn't reply. But for the first time since she was handcuffed, she gave a subtle nod. That small motion broke more walls than any speech. Jamal watched from a distance. He knew that moment wasn't for headlines. It was sacred. And dignity doesn't shout, but it changes everything it touches. Sonia Blackwell's newsroom phone rang nonstop. Universities wanted interviews. Publishers asked for book rights. The Smithsonian requested meetings, but she answered calmly. Let her decide. She's been silenced for 40 years. Now it's her turn to choose who gets to listen. Across a town in a public school, a history teacher paused class to show the article. This is the kind of hero we should be learning about. Students watched in silence. Some wiped away tears. One whispered, "She looks like my grandma." And in that moment, Opal Jenkins was no longer just forgotten. She was remembered as a symbol. The courtroom was full. Every seat taken. Journalists, veterans, activists, and curious onlookers. Cameras were in place, microphones hot, the entire nation watching. At the center bench, the judge kept a neutral face, but his eyes searched for something no document could show. Opal Jenkins entered through the side door, escorted, but not in cuffs. She wore her old military coat, worn boots, and the same cross around her neck. As she stepped into the room, silence fell like a curtain. Her presence demanded reverence. She walked slowly but with resolve toward the witness chair. Her gaze held no fear, only the calm of someone who had survived battles larger than this courtroom. Across the aisle, seated at the institutional defense table, was Karen Whitmore, stiff, pale, avoiding eye contact. Her lawyers whispered strategies, but she didn't hear them. The audience watched her every move. They knew this hearing wasn't just legal. It was moral, symbolic. It was about a country that looks away when it's convenient. When the judge asked Opal to state her name, the room held its breath. She reached for the microphone with calm hands. Opal Jenkins, war veteran, Delta Division. A journalist wiped a tear discreetly. A reporter whispered. She spoke, and something cracked in the courtroom's foundation. The prosecution asked her to recount the Delta 19 mission. She didn't hesitate. She spoke of lost comrades, of taking command after the lieutenant fell. She described the ambushes, the rescue, the moment she carried a wounded soldier on her back. And then, the silence. The orders to lie. The threats that followed. The life in the shadows. As she spoke, Each word chipped away at the myths America built around itself. Karen lowered her eyes. The judge scribbled notes. In the crowd, an older veteran whispered, "She saved lives, and now she's saving us again with truth." Then Jamal stood, a page in his hand. The judge granted permission. It was a typewritten letter, folded and faded, found among Opal's belongings, written by a soldier she saved who later died in combat. "If I don't make it back, I want the world to know I lived because of her. My name exists because she carried me when I couldn't walk." The courtroom fell silent. Jamal read each line with measured emotion. When he finished, he handed the letter to the judge. "She never asked for recognition, but she deserves our respect." A few audience members stood, not applauding, just standing in silence. Karen was called to testify. She walked hesitantly to the mic, tried to steady her voice. "The arrest followed protocol. We lacked clear information at the time." But her voice trembled. The prosecutor asked, "Did you recognize her identity during the arrest?" Karen hesitated, then said no. A journalist shouted from the back, "Or did you refuse to?" The judge called for order, but the seed was planted. Karen felt the room shift, and she knew no story she told could save her now. The truth had begun to walk on its own. When the judge called for recess, the room filled with quiet chatter. Outside, crowds gathered around big screens. People lined up to leave flowers at the police station gate. On social media, hashtags like "Justice for Opal" and "She Exists" trended nationwide. But inside, Opal remained seated, silent. Jamal sat beside her, still as a shadow. She looked down at her cross, lips moving in a prayer only she could hear. And finally she exhaled, not relief, something deeper, a surrender, the kind that comes when you've already won, just by being heard. When the judge returned, the courtroom stilled once more. He read the ruling clearly. "We acknowledge that Opal Jenkins's identity was erased through institutional omission. We recommend moral reparations, official reinstatement, and immediate inclusion in the National Registry of Decorated Veterans." The courtroom burst into applause, but she didn't smile. She bowed her head in silent prayer. Karen left through the back exit. No statements. At the end of the session, Jamal walked her to the door. A reporter called out, "Ms. Jenkins, how do you want to be remembered?" She paused, thought, then answered, "As someone who stood when no one wanted me to." The smell of fresh coffee filled the small dining room at the Elias Woodrow Veterans Center. Opal stood, as always, serving the mugs with steady hands and a calm gaze. Some veterans chuckled softly, others read their papers with hands trembling from time and memory. She listened more than she spoke, like someone who collects pain without ever displaying it. Outside, the sun warmed the concrete slowly, and the wind made the American flag sway with near-ceremonial rhythm. It was just another quiet day, and she liked it that way. But then, the silence was cut by the sound of a black government car pulling up to the curb. A man in a dark suit stepped out with determined steps. In his hands, an envelope sealed with the federal crest, and Opal's name embossed in gold. Everyone stood when the aide walked in. He scanned the room and fixed his eyes on her. "Miss Jenkins?" he asked, with unusual reverence. She simply nodded. He approached, handing over the envelope with both hands. "I bring direct orders from the president. It's confidential, but urgent." The room hung in a stillness that felt sacred. Opal held the envelope for a few moments before opening it. Inside, a formal invitation on heavy paper, silver-edged, and written in elegant script. The text read, "By personal invitation of the President of the United States, Miss Opal Jenkins is hereby appointed as Secretary of Veterans Affairs." At the bottom, a handwritten note, "You were never forgotten. This nation owes you." The room went quiet for a few long seconds. Then came the first applause, shy, emotional, rising like a tide. Some veterans wept openly, Others saluted with backs long bent, but Opal stood steady. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just held the letter with the same strength she'd used to hold an entire life together. Jamal, standing by the doorway, watched with glistening eyes. He knew this moment wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was the resurrection of a public soul buried by silence. The news would soon spread. But in that moment, what struck everyone most was how Opal closed the envelope, nodded her thanks, and quietly went back to pouring coffee. "I still have work to finish," she whispered to one of the veterans. It was her way of saying that recognition mattered, but the mission wasn't over. Deep down, she knew titles fade, but presence endures. The canvas bag was still on her shoulder. Her steps still echoed slow, but full of meaning. A young volunteer stood watching in silence. He didn't know her story, but he understood something sacred lived inside that woman, who refused to be celebrated as a hero. The phone rang again, this time at the front desk. The voice on the other end was firm and familiar. It was the president himself, asking to speak with her. Opal walked to the phone as if it were any other call. She picked up calmly, eyes fixed on the open Bible behind the counter. "Yes, sir." The conversation was short, but full of respect. He said he had followed everything, that the United States owed her a great debt, that he hoped to see her in Washington. She listened, thanked him, and said simply, "If I go, it won't be for me. It'll be for those who never had a voice." The president paused, then replied, voice thick with emotion, "Then Washington is ready to listen." She hung up and stared at the embroidered cross on the Bible cover for a while. There was her answer. This wasn't about power. It was about purpose. Later, she went to the lounge, sat alone in an old armchair by a window facing the courtyard. On her lap, the envelope, now carefully closed. She held it like one holds a name long thought lost. Memories rushed in, the faces of the soldiers she carried in her arms, the static crackle of the broken radio under fire, the pain in her wounded leg, the letter she never sent to her mother. All of it was still with her. But now something had changed. Now the world had listened, and that changed everything. The only thing she still didn't know was how it would feel to walk that stage with the whole country watching. But maybe that didn't matter as much. Outside, the city mural still hadn't been repainted. The faces on it remained the same, all white, all men. But Jamal, standing on the sidewalk, looked at that wall with new eyes. He knew what was coming, and in his pocket, he quietly carried a copy of the black and white photo of young Opal, once buried in forgotten files. It was his way of making sure her story would never be silenced again. When he walked back in, he crossed paths with her in the hallway. She greeted him with a steady look. He answered with a soft smile and a, "Miss Jenkins." Just that, but it was enough. The mural hadn't changed yet, but the nation had. The sky over Washington woke up clear, with a cold wind sweeping through the wide avenues as if cleansing the air for something new. The federal building steps glistened under winter light, while a quiet crowd began to gather around the stage. Cameras, journalists, veterans, and civic leaders waited. In the distance, the national anthem was being rehearsed, but the silence among the people said more than any note. When the black car pulled up, everyone turned. Opal stepped out calmly, her old bag on her shoulder, the same military coat, and a discreet brooch engraved with D19. No glamour, no makeup, just truth. The woman no one wanted to see now walked to center stage, and every step echoed. In the nation's bones, the announcer called her full name. General Opal Elaine Jenkins, appointed Secretary of Veterans Affairs. But that's not what moved the crowd. It was when she stood before the microphone, looked into the crowd's eyes, and took a deep breath. The wind blew again, gently lifting her gray hair. She removed her glasses for a moment, then put them back on, and said with a steady voice, I was ignored because I look like the people who've carried this country on their backs, and still do. A deep silence fell. Then came the applause. Some slow, others tearful. But she stood still, as if every sound was just an echo of what she'd already screamed in silence for decades. Among the audience were veterans she helped each week at the center. One of them slowly stood and placed his hand over his chest. Then others followed. It wasn't a pledge to the government. It was reverence to dignity. In the audience, Jamal Reese was present too, now wearing his new uniform, promoted with honor as an ethics instructor. He never looked away from Opal. There was a silent strength in her that no title could match. And in that moment he understood. She never wanted power. She only wanted to return memory to those who had lost even their names. Karen Whitmore wasn't there. Her dismissal had been signed 2 days before, and she was now under federal investigation for evidence suppression and abuse of authority. The precinct's files were under audit, and old buried complaints began to surface. Her fall was swift, but Opal never mentioned her name. Instead, she spoke of the women who died in silence, of the soldiers erased from photos, of those who returned from war only to find oblivion. "I'm not here for myself," she said. "I'm here because there are thousands who never had the chance to say me too." With each word, the crowd sank deeper. This wasn't a speech. It was testimony. At the end of the ceremony, a symbolic exhibit was opened at the Veterans Memorial. Among the items displayed, the old Delta Division medal tag, a black and white photo of young Opal, and a rusted, broken radio. The caption below read, "Commander Jenkins saved 12 lives with an injured leg and unwavering faith." The crowd walked past the glass in silence. Many cried. Others simply touched the glass and nodded as if asking history for forgiveness. Jamal brought his grandmother to see it. "A Vietnam widow," she whispered. "At last, someone who truly knows us." Back in the city, mural painters began covering old faces with fresh coats of color, and among them finally appeared Opal's deep, dignified gaze, not as a statue, but as presence. Alongside her, names of forgotten soldiers were added, all with records restored. It was a new visual chapter, where history slowly corrected itself. Children walked by hand in hand with their grandparents, pointing at the new faces. "Who is she?" they asked. And now, someone always had an answer, because silence had lost its throne. That night, back home, Opal lit a candle on the small altar in her kitchen, an old tradition she never explained to anyone. Beside the flame lay the same simple wooden cross, handmade by a soldier she once saved. She sat in her chair, placed the bag down, and remained still for long minutes. Then she picked up an old notebook and wrote, "I fulfilled what was entrusted to me." She closed her eyes, not out of exhaustion but out of gratitude, because finally the country had opened its eyes. There were no headlines that night, no more ceremonies, only the quiet peace of someone who, for the first time, no longer needed to prove anything. The city slept, but in many hearts, something had awakened. And at the Veterans Center, Opal's chair remained empty, yet respected. Because even when she's not there, her presence remains, not as a scream, but as a vow. And vows, when made for real, never vanish. Some stories end with applause, others with silence. But the most powerful ones leave marks, not for what they scream, but for what they whisper when everyone else has gone quiet. Opal Jenkins never asked for spotlights nor public reparations. What she carried couldn't fit in headlines or medals. It was a kind of honor that survives even when the world turns its back. She won without defeating anyone. And that in itself is rare enough not to be ignored, because while some build reputations with speeches, others leave legacies with scars. This wasn't about cinematic heroism, but a courage born from the everyday, the courage to keep going, even after being erased. Opal didn't seek a throne. She only wanted the forgotten to have a seat at the table. She knew being heard wasn't about shouting, but about standing firm in silence. And that's how she won. Not by the force of reaction, but by the constancy of presence. There, among worn boots and old coats, she restored something many had lost. Dignity. The Delta Division plaque isn't just oxidized metal. It's a mirror that forces a nation to face what it tried to hide for decades. And the mural, now redone with her face, is more than a tribute. It's an apology, a belated acknowledgement that history isn't made only by famous names, but by anonymous hands that held the country up when it was about to collapse. What Opal carried in her bag wasn't a secret. It was living memory. And that, not time, not bureaucracy, not prejudice, could ever destroy. Because when truth walks slowly, it still arrives. But it arrives whole. And now, perhaps the question that remains is, how many other opals are still invisible, silent, waiting for someone to truly look? How many plaques, letters, scars are being ignored in the pockets of everyday life? Maybe the answer lies less in institutions and more in us, in how we treat those who don't shine, in the respect we show to those who built before we arrived. Because sometimes a nation's redemption begins when it learns to listen to what it once tried so hard to silence, and to recognize that some metals don't glitter, they carry weight. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like Opal's are not just emotional narratives. They are wake-up calls. They are seeds. They are invitations to see the world with different eyes, more attentive, more human, more just. And perhaps, just perhaps, they're exactly what the world needs to stop repeating the same mistakes. Because those who carry scars also carry a map of where pain tried to win, but failed. And that is a victory that never ages.